Hey folks, how's it going? Welcome to BB. Tonight, Bob approved lecture series presents Tom Boram on improvisation, sound design, and noise. If this is your first time here, feel free to sign up for the mailing list in the back and be up to date with the future events. And without further ado, here's Tom Boram.
Hi, I'm Tom. Basically, Jake asked me to come and do this after I gave a talk at MICA in a sound art class. So I'm kind of sort of doing something sort of similar to what I did for the class. So I'm going to give you a little bit of about my personal history and the sort of things that I'm interested in, and then I'm also going to kind of maybe go into a little bit of a maybe kind of a PBS style science-y sound talk, just for a little bit. Hopefully, it won't be tedious or anything for anybody. I get pretty talky, and I can get off topic pretty easy. I've been cautioned about this from a lot of people, loved ones, and so forth over the years. So we'll see if I can keep things under control here. So let's move forward a little bit. This is my modular synth. I've been kind of working on this synth, and I've had this synth more or less on and off for, well, not on and off. It's always been on. It just used to be like this big. It was about this big maybe 16 years ago. And it blew up after a death. Someone that I was very close with died and gave me some money. And I blew it up a little bit. And I've done a lot of stuff to it over the years. I build a little bit. I worked with soldering and so forth. And I've built a lot of other instruments besides this, but I keep coming back to the modular synth. And I'll explain why as time goes. But I really, really connect with it quite a bit. It's a very, very important thing for me because I believe that it's sort of a combination of a sort of a raw sound workstation, and it's also an actual instrument, and it can become a musical instrument and a very playable one. So I will get into that briefly. So a little bit about me. I've been a musician my entire life. My father is like a classical musician, and he went to Peabody and so forth. So I sort of came up as a piano player. Not very good, mind you. I'm not trying to say that I'm all that, but I've been playing music my whole life. I started playing guitar when I was 13. I was playing guitar all through the 90s. I played in rock bands in the city, and I was pretty active in Baltimore, probably since, I don't know, early 90s in bands. As time went through college, I got very interested in noise and avant-garde music. Just as an anecdote, my father used to always listen to public radio and classical music my whole life, but he was very interested in like Beethoven and late Romanticism, Brahms, Wagner, Mahler, and he plays French horn. And when one day we were listening to the public radio, and this is probably when I was maybe 9 years old or something, and they were playing all this prepared piano of John Cage, and he was and I was really like, what is this? What are we listening to? And he was like, and he was very familiar with Cage because he was in Peabody in the '60s. And so he was just like, oh, this is just weird. This is, this guy's an asshole. It's nonsense. And he's like, he's like, it's ridiculous. They're putting like erasers underneath the piano strings, and I was kind of like, that is weird. I was like, yeah, that's stupid. And I remember, I remember being 13 and being in this music appreciation class, and and because of my background, my father, would like, he's kind of like drilling me with all this classical music. So by the time I was 13, I knew how to identify like all this, European art music and stuff. And I was talking to the teacher, and the teacher, would always ask me, he would always ask me questions because I sort of seemed to know, like all this stuff. And one day I was like, what's this guy who like puts all these erasers in the piano and all this stuff? And he was just, and I remember, and ever since then, he was like, you know, well, Tom Boram's a big fan of John Cage. And I was like, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. I hate that guy. But then I remember being like, I remember, you know, maybe by the time, maybe like a year later, I remember thinking to myself, like, wait a minute. No, that's all right. That's actually really kind of cool. And sure enough, you know, next thing you know, I was like preparing my guitar constantly and really experimenting with sound. And by the time I was in college, I was obsessed with jazz and free jazz. And I mostly played improvised music, and I just completely got into improvised music. And I sort of left the idea of playing in a band, playing really in a band that would play songs, or that we would even write songs. And I did a lot of stuff. This is actually a CD back when CDRs were brand new. This is like from 1997 or something. And I had a friend who wanted to put out this recording of mine, and so I just found this picture on the internet. I was looking around for pictures. But anyway, this was like I was like, whoa, he's burning CDs in his house. You know, it's like 1997. But I was really, I helped start the High Zero Festival in the end of the 90s, and I started the Red Room Performance Space with a group of people, and we still do a lot of concerts there. I think probably some of you folks have probably been there. We started the High Zero Festival in 1999, but previous to that, one of the biggest influence on me at that time, you know, and this was kind of me emerging from my my era of wanting to actually play songs, was this guy Toshi Makihara, who's a percussionist from Philadelphia. And the first time I saw him, it completely blew my mind. It completely rearranged my entire brain, because he kind of looks like that. Like, he sort of looks like a, I don't know, like a Japanese businessman or something. And he's always really straight-faced. And I actually hung out with him. I mean, I've stayed at his house, I've gone on tour with him and stuff, and he really isn't that, he doesn't really have a sense of humor. But he's like, but it's really crazy, because the first time I saw him play, it was like insane, because he was already like in his 40s, you know, in the 90s. And he'd been doing improvised music on the East Coast and in New York and Philly and all, you know, pretty much all over the place, all through the 80s. He moved here from Japan. And he like studied Butoh in Japan, and so there was always this sense of his, like, that he was doing movement a little bit. And so every time that I ever saw him play, I was like, whoa, this is like a real performance. Like, this guy is really like, this is a thing to see. It's like a spectacle, because he would be really straight-faced, but he would have like he'd have this like piece of styrofoam on the ground. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of the performance, he'd reach up, and there would be full of slinkies underneath it that would be attached to it. And he'd be flinging them everywhere. And it would sound amazing, because it would be like 12 slinkies, and it'd be like, you know? But the crazy thing is, they would be flying everywhere, but they never hit anybody. And I never understood how he never hit anybody. And a lot of times, he'd be throwing stuff all over the place, and he'd be throwing drumsticks and all this stuff. But he never damaged anything or never hit anything. And I was always kind of amazed by that, because it always seemed like he was definitely going to hurt somebody or break something, but he never did. And I think that it's his control, because it's like his experience as a Butoh dancer or something, that it's like he has like a really like a lot of control, but I don't understand how he got that much. You know, I don't know. I don't understand how he works. It's like it's really like, it just comes natural with him, and I don't know. I mean, he's very conservative now, and he mostly plays like really straight music, and he kind of is moved in a lot more to his you know, sort of his vibe. Like, he's a lot more like that really straight-laced guy, but at that time, he would do stuff like, sometimes he would be playing drums with a feather duster. And he'd have 2 feather dusters instead of drumsticks. And he'd be like playing really fast, like really crazy, like doing all this stuff, but you could barely hear it, because it would just be like the feathers, like just like lightly tapping the cymbals and like lightly tapping the drums and stuff. And you know, and I've seen him play with fly swatters. But the funny thing is that a lot of people would be laughing, and sometimes he'd be playing with really serious musicians, and he'd have like a sax player playing with him, and the sax player would be like, you know, and then all of a sudden the sax player would hear people in the audience laughing, and you would see the sax player be like, you know, kind of look around like, what the hell is Toshi doing? And you know, and Toshi would be like, he would have like the cooler like against the wall, and he'd be holding it with his head, and he'd be like holding a beat with one hand, and like, I don't know, he just did a lot of crazy stuff. I mean, it's kind of hard to explain, but it was sort of like, I always loved the sounds. Like, I always loved the sounds that he was generating, but there was a very much like a performance. And you know, one of the things that a lot of folks will end up criticizing about improvised music and experimental music is that a lot of times it's very, very intellectual. and that it feels like the performers are, sitting in front of a computer, or maybe even sitting in front of something like this, and that it's not very visceral, that there's not a lot of feedback with the audience. And the experience with Toshi was just the opposite of that, so that really, it made a big difference in my life. And it also was, I never saw him really do the same performance twice. And so that was also very interesting too, because there was always something to see, there was always something very interesting that he was doing on stage. And it was really spontaneous, and I think that he, through his experiences with Butoh and then his many, many years, the first time I saw him was 96 or 97, and he'd been doing improvised music, since the late 70s in Japan and on the East Coast. So he really had a wealth of experience, and he was bringing that. So seeing somebody that age, somebody in their 40s, and the sort of, the sublime, bringing the sublime out like that was really influential for me. So I was always interested in electronic music, and in the 90s I went to a lot of raves, and I did a lot of acid and stuff. And I kind of always wanted to do electronic music, but I didn't quite know how to do it. And I never thought that there would be an opportunity for me to really learn, the sort of language of electronics, because I spent so much time learning jazz and jazz harmony and that sort of thing. And in the late 90s, I started seeing a lot and meeting a lot more people who were working with electronics and improvised music, and I started to realize more and more that I could bring the two together, or that I could bring something that is very nimble and dynamic like jazz, and bring it in and bring electronics into that very successfully. So the first person I ever saw doing that was I was out in tour in Chicago, and I went into a place and I saw this guy Jim Baker playing, and he had an ARP 2600, which is a classic semi-modular synthesizer from the 70s. They used it to make the R2D2 sounds for Star Wars. He was really amazing because he, by the way, you'll notice that all these guys are dorks. So anyway, that's an aside. But Jim was he was changing the patches while he was playing, and I always thought his playing was really good. The thing about the ARP 2600 is it definitely has the ability to interface with a keyboard, and so he's sort of manifesting a lot like a piano player, and he's actually a really good jazz pianist. I met Charles Cohen. Some of you might know him because he actually sort of had a kind of a comeback recently in the last couple of years, and they reissued a lot of his earlier recordings, and I think he has a new recording now that's out. But I also met him at the Red Room, probably 1997, and he was working really well with improvisers. And he too, was coming from a background of composition, of electronic music, and all this stuff. And he, if some of you folks might know Pauline Oliveros, but he, had done some listening sessions with her and done workshops with her in the 80s and 70s. He has a real history with electronics, but he himself in the late 80s and early 90s turned to improvisation, just I think because of the personal reward of being in a situation like that, where the outcome of any kind of sound gathering could go in any direction. This guy, Michael Johnson, these two gentlemen here made probably the biggest impact on me though, and Michael Johnson is really incredible instrument designer. He's actually he's a super genius. He's very obscure, and I think it's just because of his personality. He's a very reactionary thinker, but he designs all of his own circuits, and every time I've ever seen him play, it was like this. He basically is a modular synthesizer, but instead of having it all together, he builds them in discrete boxes. I'm not really sure why he wants to do it that way, but it's just his kind of style. And most of the electronics that he uses are salvage stuff, he goes through dumpsters or goes through thrift stores and just pulls parts and salvages parts. He's an incredible reader of old manuals and electronics things, and now he actually designs modular synthesizers, but it's just like a money gig. He's not really interested in it. He's much more interested in this very esoteric kind of thing. And he's not a very physical, player. He's sort of the kind of intellectual person that I was talking about, who's sort of huddled over the instruments and kind of, turning knobs and kind of thinking through all the stuff that he's doing. But his music's extremely minimalist, and it's very weird, and it's very, very weird. And he really influenced me a lot, because he would always give me these tapes in the 90s, and I had a tape deck in my car, and it would be these tapes that would be unlabeled, and I would put them in, and it would be like this sound that would be like, but then that would be like all you would hear for like 15 minutes, and so I would just be, you know, driving like I would be running errands and driving all over the place, and there would just be these weird sounds that would happen like once every 10 minutes. But that's kind of like what he's like. I mean, that's what Michael's like. I mean, he's really, really abstract, and I think that his level of you know, his presentation, like, you know, showing up at a show, it takes him like 2 hours to set that up, and then he's always playing on the floor, and he always has like a little lamp or something, and one time I actually had a lamp, and it was actually under the voltage control of one of the instruments, and so there was a sound going like whoop, 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 and the lamp was like blinking in the same rhythm. Yeah, he's really amazing. But you know, when I saw Thomas Lang, it really made a big difference to me. This guy he's a German improviser, and he plays a really old synth from Britain from the 60s, and it's in very good condition. It's an EMS synthy, and he was probably that was probably the biggest thing. Like, that was the huge moment for me. Like, that was probably on the same level of influencing me as Toshi, because Thomas is like was like incredibly physical, and it almost looks like he's getting electrocuted. Like, you know, it's like he's constantly like, but there's a thing is that he'll like be listening to a sound, and he'll hear a sound, and you can see in his brain that he gets an idea, and he goes really, really fast into the synth and like starts making changes really, really fast. And then there's this pin matrix, so all the patching, instead of done with cables, sort of done with this kind of you know, XY grid where all the patch points are on these, and you can accomplish them with pins. And sometimes I'd see him like thinking about something really fast, and he'd grab a pin next to him and stick it in really fast and like keep playing, and the sound would be totally different because he'd be making these really fast changes. So his level of virtuosity was really, really high, very, very accomplished player, but like totally crazy, and his sounds are very not synthesizer sounds, you know, like almost all the sounds that he would work with would never remind you of like something that would be coming from a keyboard. Like he's triggering it with the keyboard, but it's just because he has a history of a piano, and the piano keyboard is a very comfortable interface. But the actual sounds are really like nervous system, like crazy sounds, and his level of energy. And there was during that period, I think that most of the people who saw him were really blown away, but I was really, really, really influenced. And I think I just decided then that I was going to make the move from guitar to synthesizer, because I had a lot of experience with the piano, and I figured that, you know, I was very comfortable with the piano myself, and that's just what I wanted to do. So I moved to the synthesizer rather. And I just put this on here just for fun, but like, you know, for me, for like performing wise, I've always been a little bit concerned that, you know, because I'm coming out of the guitar so much and playing in rock bands and playing guitar in like jazz bands and stuff, that the piano was a little bit like intellectual or something, that is not a very interesting experience to look at. But I think now I think of the synthesizer as sort of an extension of the piano, and I have like two sort of piano heroes that I'm interested in. One is Thelonious Monk, just because he's incredible personality and has a lot of personality in his music. But he also is very hip, you know, and I think that he just, you know, his presence, you know, on stage, it's a hipness. And I'm kind of keep going back to this idea of like what you see on stage, because improvisation I don't think is a very satisfying thing to listen to on a record. You know, it's more about being in a room with people while they're playing and they're thinking of stuff and they're coming up with ideas. And you know, for Monk, you know, this is like the ultimate like hip intellectual musician, really, of the mid 20th century. I mean, he's like very, very quirky, and like, you know, very innovative player. But it's also sort of like, you know, him with his piano, and it's I think that sort of, you know, changed the idea of like what a hip person would look like, you know, on stage. Jerry Lee Lewis, you know, is kind of an interesting person, because, you know, what you know, Hendrix and what later guitar players became famous for, he was actually doing in the 50s. Like, he's setting his piano on fire and stuff, but he's actually famous for when he would perform in television studios, a lot of times he would break the pianos, and the record label would have to buy the television studio like a new piano, because he was so crazy. He's like such a crazy performer. So, you know, so the piano is actually can be very rock and roll, and I just wanted to reinforce that. That's why I put it. So I think that one of the things where I'm going to start talking about sound design is because what happened is that I started getting interested in the modular synthesizer because, you know, in improvisation, a lot of what improvisation is in experimental music is about finding new timbres, finding new ways of you know, creating sounds that haven't been heard. The synthesizer can create extremely familiar sounds just because they've been around for a long time now. They've been around almost 50 years, and a lot of people are very familiar with the sort of synth vocabulary. But the modular synth, on the other hand, is very simple building blocks. And so you can kind of take apart the sounds, and you can deal with sounds in a very sort of atomic level, like what's really making up the sound. You know, the typical synthesizer, obviously, of the 70s and the 80s is something that was pre-patched, where much of this is done underneath the surface, and it's kind of telling you what to do, and it has a certain set of sounds, and those are the sounds that becomes, like in the 80s, you can kind of tell an 80s sounding synth because that was sort of the design style then and the technology, and it has a certain kind of sound. Whereas, you know, with the modular synth, you can be mixing digital, you can mix analog, you can do all these kind of things. You can have the entire history of electronic music all together, and then the way that you can put it together can be completely different. Like everybody would approach it differently because it's sort of a blank canvas. So what I kind of compare it to, and the reason why, you know, like I'm going to get into this thing kind of shortly, where I'll go into more detail about this, but it's sort of what I see that these guys like Thomas Lenn, or maybe what I'm trying to do myself, is that I am kind of trying to create new instruments or create new workflows, like for every time that I play, and I'm sort of designing like a new instrument. And what I compare it to is a sort of like maybe creating a language, because you have to know a certain amount of like how sound works, and you have to know a certain amount of how electronics work to be able to keep developing new things with it. So what I compared it to is a sort of like creating a language, but also being like, you have to know a lot of grammar to make up a language. So what kind of amazed me about Thomas Lenn was that I thought that he is obviously, or Jim Baker or any of those guys, they're sort of like engineers and performers. And so an engineer and a performer, you know, maybe in, if it would be sort of like, you know, is everyone familiar with Esperanto? Do we guys have some? Is everybody familiar with Esperanto? Okay, so Esperanto is a made-up language. I forget who made it up, but it's like these academics, I think like maybe 50, 60 years ago. And they basically were like, we're going to create a universal language. The whole world, all the problems are going to be solved because everybody will just speak Esperanto. So anyway, in order to make a language, you actually have to know grammar really well, and you have to understand how grammar works, and then you can make your own language. So what I think is happening if you're like building crazy instruments to make new sounds, it's almost like you have to like learn grammar and really understand grammar very, very well. Then you like create Esperanto, and then you just create Esperanto. So you go through all this trouble to engineer a new language, so you can write poetry in your own language, so you don't have to write it in Russian or English or whatever. So anyway, William Shatner, also who played Captain Kirk, was actually in a movie that was entirely in Esperanto, and it's actually about these women who follow Satan. And it's called Incubus. This is before Star Trek, by the way. This woman looks human, but she's actually she's a follower of Satan. She's actually from hell. You get the idea. So moving right on. So anyway, so this is a sort of maybe a classification structure. I just kind of came up with it. It's a little bit meaningless. Afterwards, if we want to talk afterwards, if you want to like argue with this because there's a lot of loopholes in it, that's totally fine. I'm just making some categories just for fun. It's just for discussion. Don't take it too seriously. But I kind of came up with these three categories of sound design, and one I call physical, the next one I call tape, and the last one I call electronic or synthetic. And I'll explain that. Okay, so Neil Feather, some of you might know him. He won the Sondheim and he won the Trawick Prize this past year. He's got a little bit of money left till he runs out. Anyway, he's a great instrument builder, and he's sort of like the kind of guy who you know, understands materials very, very well. And so physical sound design is what I consider like something like Harry Partch. Some of you might know Harry Partch. It is somebody who's using sort of maybe the vocabulary of instruments that already exist, but they're altering them to make unique sounds. One of the things that Neil uses a lot is like he uses a lot of vibrators, you know, like sex toys. Because vibrators have set frequencies, and then you can get a lot of sounds from them, very, you know, sort of pitched sounds, very kind of electronic sounds. He uses magnets. He does a lot of string instruments that are very much like guitars, but they go far past what a guitar can do sonically. And so he's basically somebody who's like dealing with materials, and he's innovating that way. Like I just watched Star Trek the movie, the original Star Trek movie from 1979. Has anyone ever seen that? Well, anyway, there's this thing that's coming from deep space. It's like this cloud, and it's just killing everything. It's just like electrocuting ships, and it's heading for Earth, and it's going to like destroy the Earth. And anyway, the sound, every time it comes on screen, you hear this sound. It's like bow, and it's this really low, crazy like string electronic sound. And it was actually done by an instrument that has like a 30-foot long string. And it's a kind of, I read about it on the Wikipedia page. So basically, like, they wanted this like really amazing sound for this thing that's happening on screen. And so the sound designers knew a composer who was working with these instruments, and they commissioned the composer to bring the instrument into the studio. And so they were recording this like bow kind of thing. And so that would be an example of physical sound design. Okay, so the next thing is I'm calling it tape. And tape sound design is basically what electronic music was before synthesizers. It's the idea of using analog tape. But I think that tape as a sound generation technique, or as a sound manipulating technique, kind of had a sort of faded out after the synthesizer came about in the mid-60s, but it came back in the 80s with the sampler, because the sampler is just, you know, the digital version of the tape. And so the really famous sound designer in Hollywood named Ben Burtt, who did all the Star Wars movies and all this Spielberg and all this stuff, he is a great example of somebody who is always thinking about how to manipulate recorded material. And so an example of like, you know, obviously a lot of electronic music like Stockhausen and all this stuff was, you know, done on tapes and messing with tapes and like old military kind of radio grade equipment and recording them and so forth. But Ben Burtt, what he would do, like for instance, obviously in Indiana Jones or Raiders of the Lost Ark, when the giant ball is chasing him, you know, that ball probably only weighs like 4 pounds. It's probably like made out of, I don't know, plastic or something. But you know, they wanted to sound like it weighs a couple tons and it's rolling. So basically I watched this video of Ben Burtt where he's got a shotgun mic and a recorder, and he's hanging out the back of a station wagon, and there's this gravel road that's on a pitch, probably somewhere outside of LA. And so they put the car in neutral so the engine wouldn't make any sound. And they're just drifting down, and he's hanging off the back of the station wagon with the shotgun mic pointed at the back wheel as it's rolling across the gravel. And so that sound was pitched down quite a bit to give it a lot more weight and a lot more bass. And then, when you hear the ball going, like rolling after Indiana Jones, you know, it's a sound that was recorded out of the physical world, and then it was manipulated electronically on magnetic tape. Another example of that would be the Godzilla roar. The famous Godzilla roar is actually the sound of a guy holding wearing a rubber glove and holding a viola and scraping his hand down the viola string. And so that sounds very like, but when it's pitched down, it's like, you know, and it's Godzilla. So anyway, so moving right along, we have we're getting into electronics, and so basically, you know, so I'm getting away from improvisation here because you know, what's happened is because of my interest in modular synthesizers, I'm sort of forced to really learn what's actually happening with sound, which I never bothered to do previous to that. And you know, so sound, the essence of sound is basically the sine wave. A lot of you are familiar with this, but I'm going to just talk about it anyway because it's very interesting. But the sine is a mathematical function. And basically, it's the most simple sound that you could ever make. And so what you have here is that it's sort of like the function of it's kind of like a wheel. So if you can imagine a fixed point on this wheel, as you start rolling the wheel, it's going to start following the curve of a sine wave. And then a spring is another example. As long as the spring isn't being dampened by gravity, like in this GIF, this basically, if you had a fixed point on there and you were moving a piece of paper back there, it would be drawing a sine wave. So let's have a look. The sine wave, the opposite of the sine wave is going to be white noise. So a sine wave is only going to give you one frequency, and it's only going to give you one harmonic. And it is like that. And that is it. Now, I'm going to talk a lot more about this, but basically, we have two different graphs here. This graph is the oscilloscope. That's the one that most people are familiar with. But this graph is the spectroscope. And the spectroscope is actually a lot more interesting than the oscilloscope, because the spectroscope is what is really happening with the wave. Because the sine wave has no harmonics, it really doesn't have, it has no character. It's a sound that has absolutely no character. And the reason you can't tell by looking at it whether it has character or not, because all this graph is amplitude and time, whereas this graph is amplitude and frequency. Right now, there's only one frequency with no harmonics, so you're only seeing this peak. So as I increase in frequency, let's see what happens. Okay, so what just happened? Well, obviously the waves get closer together because they increase in frequency, but this peak is, there's only this one peak. So basically, what you're hearing is you're only hearing a tone at this frequency. Where what's very interesting is that most sounds that we hear in life, sine waves don't occur that much in life. They do occur though, like whistling is usually a sound wave, or sine wave, rather. But most things like music or anything is going to be much more busy on the spectroscope than a sine wave. So let's hear what the opposite of a sine wave is, which is noise. Let's have a look. So with noise is completely aperiodic. What do I mean by that? I mean that noise the frequency never repeats. So what you see here is something that has like no discernible wave behavior. And then what you see here is that it's more or less every sound or every frequency at equal amplitude all at the same time. So basically you're seeing the amplitude is fairly evenly distributed and that every frequency is occurring at the same time. So that's the opposite of a sine wave. So that's the most complex sound. And it really doesn't have any character because it's like it's every frequency at the same time. Incidentally, I just wanted to kind of share this with you. This is a sort of an interesting thing, but white noise generators in the analog world are generated by hooking up a transistor incorrectly. So when you hook up a transistor backwards, the way that you're not supposed to, like a transistor is obviously the primary component of a computer, and in a computer they're used for switching or creating switches. So so think about that. So with a switch, you're telling the electron that's passing through the circuit at that moment exactly what to do. Whereas if you hook up the transistor backwards, the electron is sort of like quantum mechanics or quantum physics. The electron has no location in the universe, and so basically you're seeing white noise is generated with a transistor is kind of like experiencing quantum physics because the electron is in every position at once. So it's pure. It's pure noise. It's pure random. Okay, so moving along, I will now show what what a sawtooth wave looks like. And let me turn that down a little bit. Okay, so this wave is a very basic synthesizer wave, very commonly heard throughout the 70s. But you see, it's instead of having that one peak, there's harmonics that decrease in amplitude exponentially all the way across the entire frequency spectrum. You can see it a little more if I turn up the frequency. You can kind of see how the harmonics are fairly evenly spaced. Actually, a sawtooth wave only gives you the most harmonics of any simple wave. It is like all the even and odd harmonics, so they all relate to the fundamental pitch. So this here would be the fundamental. That's the main note that you hear. So if I like turn this off, that's the fundamental. That's this dominant sound, and then these are all the harmonics that follow. So basically, what makes any sound different from any other sound is just the way that the sound is shaped, or the way that the wave is shaped, and it changes the harmonic qualities. So let's listen to some other waves, or let's have a look at a few other waves. This one's very quiet. Looks kind of like a sine wave. As you can see, it's not it looks like a sine wave, but it's not a sine wave. And the reason why that first sine wave that I showed you was only giving one harmonic is because it's made digitally, so it's much more likely to be perfect. But perfect sine waves are sort of mathematical things. Like, they don't really exist. Like, it's sort of a theory. Like, if you go to a Wikipedia page for a sine wave or whatever, there's all these mathematical functions. They're used in trigonometry and so forth. It's a theoretical thing. It's not a real thing. But let's see what this. Now it's like a sawtooth wave. You can see those harmonics coming up. This is basically filtering, and this is what a filter is going to do. It's filtering out the harmonics. Check out the spectroscope. It's very interesting. Now waves like this, I know this from experience, because I've seen a lot of sound waves of vocals and what makes up vowel sounds and like the human voice. And this has a few resonant points, and you can kind of see where the resonances are. And I can tell you right now that this is basically what a waveform looks like that's coming out of a vowel. So that's no consonants, that's no percussive, so none of the plosives of my voice or none of the guttural sounds that are forming the consonants, but just the vowels. They look like this. And so I actually rigged up a little patch here where I can kind of jam a little bit, and you'll see that it's kind of sounds a little bit like talking, because this is sort of like working with what this kind of resonance of a voice. Well, it's a little talky anyway. I find it a little talky. Anyway, so let's move right along here. So I was talking a little bit about this before, but I'm going to get into a little more detail with it. So when I'm thinking about sound design, I've done a bunch of sound design. I was actually going to play something for you. I should have. I forgot. But I actually did sound design for this whole cartoon, where I did a Roadrunner cartoon, and I did everything on this modular synth. So I did every single sound electronically, and so I had to recreate all the physics of things falling, people dropping off cliffs, all the Acme explosives, and I had to do all that stuff. So I had to think about what makes the sound, and that's why I'm kind of giving this little brief talk about the sort of what makes up sound. So sound is basically time domain. It could either, you can either think of it in the time domain or in the frequency domain. Now the time domain is the oscilloscope. Like I said, that's the one that most people are comfortable with. The time domain is what you see when you look at Pro Tools, etc., where you look at waveforms in like a digital audio workstation. That's the oscilloscope. Now the frequency domain is more like the spectroscope, and that's showing you where the resonant peaks are in the wave. So basically in this drawing you can kind of see that. So basically this physicist named Fourier is saying that, this is I think in the mid-19th century, is saying that all sounds are made up of sine waves. Okay, so he mathematically modeled this thing where you can create any wave, recreate any waveform just by adding sine waves together. So this is almost a square wave. You folks probably know what a square wave looks like, but it's made out of 6 sine waves. So just by stacking 6 harmonically related sine waves, you can make a square wave. So not quite, but if you added a couple more to that, Like maybe if you added like 20 more to that, you could be getting really close to a square wave. So the frequency domain is more analytical because the frequency domain is just telling you what harmonics are there, and it's a much more abstract. So I put these pictures up here to kind of illustrate the difference between time domain and frequency domain. As I said, frequency domain is a lot more weird and interesting because it's mathematical and it's sort of it's an analytical mathematical thing, and it's very strange. So anyway, so time domain is kind of like Doctor Who. It's not really like Doctor Who, but I just put that up there anyway. but you know, Doctor Who's like traveling through time, and so basically the wave is traveling through time, and that's what you see on an oscilloscope, is that it's moving through time. It's got amplitude, and the amplitude is changing in time. So frequency domain, on the other hand, is a lot more like Cthulhu from H.P. Lovecraft. Cthulhu is like Cthulhu doesn't really exist. Cthulhu exists in all times. Neither male nor female. It's just an it. It just exists in your mind. It's theoretical. Cthulhu is like a theoretical demon that just kind of lives in the netherworld. That's sort of what the frequency domain is. Anyway. So this gives you an idea of how additive synthesis works. And what I was just saying is that they're basically saying that the more sine waves that you add together. Now remember, you would have to add, since I'm telling you now, and I know this for a fact, sawtooth wave is the fundamental, and then every odd and even harmonic, every single one, as it goes up the harmonic series, but just at a slightly decreasing amplitude, exponentially decreasing amplitude. So if you could, so theoretically, if you had, say, this drawing, or this illustration here has slowly adding 50 sine waves to the original sine wave. And you can see the effect of it, and it's telling you how many sine waves are being added together. So by the time they add 50 sine waves together, you're basically getting a sawtooth wave. That's how it works. Additive synthesis doesn't really require, synthesizing a sawtooth wave doesn't require adding. You don't need 50 sine waves. They make them electronically. I just put this up here for fun. I know it's not going to make sense to most people, but basically you can just create a sawtooth wave electronically. It's very common to do in the analog world. You don't need to make it additive. But just going back to the additive thing, actually a Hammond organ is sort of an early additive synthesizer. And the main thing is that the drawbars on the organ are adding harmonics at set intervals to the original sound. So most of the notes, most of the keys that a Hammond organ is playing is actually a chord. It's not just a single note, it's actually a chord. And I can show you, because I have a sort of an organ sound here that I'm going to demo. What happened to that? Rats. No, it's there. Huh. There it is. Okay, so. All right, there you go. So. So basically, it sounds a little bit like an organ. It's not in tune, and so you're used to hearing an organ actually playing in tune. So it doesn't quite sound like an organ. You might not think it does. I think it does. Well, so what we're seeing here is that this particular thing is that these two resonant peaks, it's actually, I find this kind of interesting, the way this waveform's model is that the second peak is actually higher than the lower peak, which is very unorthodox. But so basically the fundamental is here, and then this is the seventh. So on an organ, all the intervals are musically related, and so as you're bringing up the notes, they're musically related to each other. So just as you can see here, let me slow down that wave a little bit, or try to get it so it looks a little more clear. There we go. Okay, so as you notice, there's a sine wave that's moving very slow, and then there's 7. So for every cycle, there's 7. And so this is not a seventh in the sense of a seventh on a piano. This is actually a just intonation seventh in the sense that there's exactly 7 harmonics, or rather, there's exactly 7 cycles inside of one cycle. So you're seeing, so the fact that you can kind of see the 7 in every cycle, that gives you the 2 peaks. So there's the fundamental and there's the 7th. And so with an organ, if you had an organ that was making denser chords, or you were bringing up all the stops on the organ, you would basically be seeing all the fundamental for each of the stops that are being brought up. Now these aren't perfect sine waves, so it's a little dirty. As you can see, there's a lot of harmonic activity in there besides the fundamentals, because they're not very well executed waveforms. That was just a little aside. I think that organs are cool. I thought I would share that with you. Okay, so this is extremely cool. This is also going to demonstrate how this sort of sine wave and noise thing. So does anyone know Tristan Parrish, or is anyone familiar with his art? Well, anyway, he did this at the MoMA. This particular exhibit wasn't at the MoMA, but this installation was in the MoMA. So what you see here is this is a huge wall, and it has little tiny speaker cones in it. There's 1,500 of them, and each one is a sine wave, and they're all microtonally tuned, with the lowest one there, and then they slowly move up this way, going all the way up to 4 octaves. So he found 1,500 different pitches inside of 4 octaves. So when you're standing where the camera is right now, it just sounds like white noise, because all the waves are interacting with each other in a way that's completely inharmonic. And so if you looked at it on a spectroscope, you would see the same thing that I showed you when you saw white noise. It's basically all the frequencies, because the harmonics of all those sine waves interacting with each other, it's so inharmonic and it's so chaotic that it's basically white noise. Now, what happens is as the camera, the built-in mic on the camera, as it moves in closer, you start hearing the notes. And then the fact that it's higher on this end of the installation and it goes down, you can hear that all the frequencies change. So let's listen. Pretty cool though. Okay, so now the last thing that I wanted to do was maybe just for fun, kind of show you how I like to how I would like make a sound for my band, like Leprechaun Catering. So some of you maybe have seen Leprechaun Catering, but we basically we improvise all of our sets. They can be really wild, noisy kind of things. Jason and I and Dan, have listened to a lot of jazz. We listen to a lot of everything. So our music's sort of a combination of these things. But the main thing that's happening is that it's improvised. So I would make a sound like this, and I would, maybe before we would actually play, I would create a sound, or I would want to make an instrument with this. Usually for a performance, I'll make maybe, say, 3 instruments with this, where I'll patch up 3 different instruments. So this is kind of a simple patch. The way I have it set up now, it's leaving room for maybe 1 or 2 other ideas that I could work with at a show. And so maybe just for fun, I would come up with a sound that I want to emulate. And I'm not really going to emulate it, because the synth is a modular synth is a very finite thing. There's only so many oscillators. There's only so many filters. There's only so many controls that I have. I can't make a I can't make a really crazy sound. I can't physically model you know, a really complex, you know, insane sound, I can come kind of close. And that's the thing, is I sort of like the fact that it always sounds electronic, or it always sounds a little bit strange. But I like getting ideas from the physical world, and I like thinking about what's physically making up a sound. So most of us are familiar with gamelan music, but I made a sound and kind of a performance interface that I can kind of do this sort of fake Balinese kind of thing. And let's just watch this video, and I'll talk about it in a second. Notice that, okay, hold on, I'm gonna pause for a second. Notice that what just happened, that they muted these sort of xylophones, which have a much longer ring to them than these gongs here have a very short ring, but these have a long ring. And a lot of times it sounds really good, or obviously you can tell that they want the sound to ring out really long, but other times they don't want it to, and you can see that they're grabbing and they're muting the vibrations of the tines. So let's check that out. And I just went there. I don't know if you can really hear good on this sound system, but that big one is a nice, really low one, and I really like that sound. I'll talk about that decay in a second. So basically, I made up this sound here. This is my sort of patch. Don't make fun of me. So it's a little bit like that. Anyway, so I'll talk about how I did it, and sort of a way I'm thinking with regards to this. So this is basically made from 6 sine waves, and basically the sine waves that I'm using, like the first set of sine waves are these. So there's these 2 sine waves here, this one and this one. Okay, and then they're coming out here. So I'm processing them with something called a ring modulator. And a ring modulator is basically, it's sort of like the way that an AM radio works. It's combining the 2 sounds, and it's creating, it's rejecting the original frequencies, and it's giving you the sum and the difference frequencies. So you have those 2 sine waves at the that I showed you before, and then you get this at the output. So that's one gong, and then there's another gong that's these sine waves here. Well, it's a weird one. Okay. And there's some other ones that sound like this. And this. It's a low one. They all have different tunings. And so when I push these different pads, these touch pads, they all have different tunings, so it makes it feel like it's going through different different size gongs. It's basically changing the size of the gong. So there's one output. Here's another one. So basically what you're having is, so you basically have 6 oscillators, and each pair of 2, or every 2 oscillators is going through a ring modulator, which eventually sounds like this, because they're all getting mixed together. Now, so this is what it sounds. So basically, this is what I would consider to be the sound of, say, 3 gongs being played at the same time. Now, I'm using a crossfader that's fading them all at a random interval. So I'm basically using a random voltage that's making them crossfade. This is what happens when there's no crossfade. And the fact that they're all being crossfaded like that gives it a lot of life, or it gives the sound a little bit more life, in my opinion. And so it makes it sound more natural, because gongs are very, gongs are made of metal, and so, so those gongs, like, because of the kind of metal, they have they always sort of have a couple sounds that you hear at once. And so basically, you're going to have one reason why they sound kind of nice together is that they're all made of the same kind of metal, and so that the resonance, or the sort of essence, the structure, the material structure of that is resonating at a certain frequency. And so as you increase the size, you get one resonance, which is the mechanical resonance of the thing vibrating, and then also the internal resonance, that's the resonant frequency of the metal. And so you kind of get a note that is not harmonic. It's not a very melodic sound. And a lot of people really like this. Sort of think of a steel drum, the way a steel drum sounds. Kind of nowadays, most of us, when we hear a steel drum band playing, we probably want to run in the other direction. But it's actually a really beautiful sounding instrument, and it's a very complex sound, and it's because of the metal. It's just basically, it's more or less impossible to make something out of metal be like very clean harmonically. It's always going to be messy. There's always going to be weird notes and dissonances. So with this kind of setup that I have now, there's so much like clashing sounds that it's sounding a lot like a gong. Now the last element of it is this, is that I have to shape the amplitude, because what I've been playing you is a sound that's just going zzz, and it's not percussive. So the percussive sound needs to have a percussive shape. So all percussion in this world, yes, this is the anyway. The sound, the amplitude of the sound will decay on an exponential scale. So basically everything in nature kind of works in an exponential way. The sound doesn't go down at this interval over time. It goes down very sharply, and then it tapers off, and that's the way all sounds are. So I sort of have a way of generating a mathematical function in my synthesizer that generates an exponential signal that starts at a high voltage and ends at a low voltage, and it tells an amplifier to close off the sound across an exponential scale. So basically what's happening is that at a very long scale, it would be like this. And the sound's decaying. And then I programmed it to do a short one. So I can do this sort of clamping like those players were doing, where they grab the sound, so it's going, and I clamp it. So I have a couple different lengths programmed. So I have this length, I have this length, and I have the long one. And so that way you can do, I can get into a thing like this where I'm going. So that's how I did it. That's all I got. I have nothing else to say. Thank you.